So we are going to continue the sermon series that we started a couple of weeks ago called Signs of the Times, Rediscovering Revelation. And yes, we have been studying the book of Revelation, probably the most controversial, misunderstood, and misinterpreted book of the Bible. And it's interesting because when we started doing this sermon series, even before I started, but especially after we started, I had lots of folks that have said to me, I never have read that book because it scares me. You know, when I have read it, it scared me. I don't understand a lot of the things that are in it, and it just seems to be like a gloom and doom kind of thing. I don't even want to read it. And, you know, a lot of us have friends and family members who, when we're going through calamity or there's natural disasters or, I don't know, a pandemic, that they will start to point to the book of Revelation saying, aha, you know, these are obviously prophecies that are being fulfilled, and so the end of the world is nigh. And so it's difficult for a lot of us to try to figure out what Revelation is saying, first of all, and then to try to figure out, like, what is it doing in the Bible, right? Because that's what a lot of us would wonder. Like, why? Like, okay, I get that so much of, you know, the Bible, there's mysterious things about it, but, you know, that one sort of takes it to a new level. And so that's what we've been trying to do, is to dig into the book of Revelation and to begin to see it differently, to rediscover it, and to see it as it was meant to be seen by John the Revelator, who was writing this book as a letter to 7 churches that were in what is now modern-day Turkey. All of these churches were different. As we talked about last week, they were made up of people from various walks of life and classes and races, religious backgrounds, some who were patriotic and when it came to the Roman rule, and some who absolutely weren't. Some were going through persecution and others weren't. And so John is writing a letter that is certain to upset some people, and then also to give incentive for those who are oppressed to continue to persevere. But really and truly, John is writing a letter that is full of hope and where evil doesn't get to win. And I think that's pretty awesome. So today, we're actually going to be exploring some of the most dramatic visions that you find in the book of Revelation. So we're going to talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and some other things as well. But we're also going to learn what it means to find meaning in calamity, which I think many of us would feel like that's a really good exercise right about now, right? Because a lot of us, when we're going through calamity, when we're dealing with challenges and all those kinds of things, you know, we find ways to cope with calamity. You know, we find ways to cope with our trials and tribulations. I'm going to call this part of the sermon, Feeling Sorry for Yourself, a primer. Because that's kind of what a lot of us will do when we go through some tough stuff, right? So when we're dealing with all kinds of things like a pandemic or personal tragedy or issues or just, you know, crazy stuff. Like for those of you who were around in Austin last year, close to this time, we had just a little bit of a storm that, you know, reduced all of us to having to boil snow in order to cook pasta or flush our toilets, depending on what was necessary. You know, so there were moments over the past year or maybe 2, or maybe you're just dealing with some stuff personally, you're going through some junk. And so we deal with things differently. I mean, we all try to cope with it, and we will sometimes get to feeling sorry for ourselves. And so in the midst of that, we will do some things, right? So I'm going to just be vulnerable and just share with you some of the things that I do when I'm feeling sorry for myself. First, I eat a lot. And I mean like really good food, you know? Like Whataburger, you know, some Torchies, you know, like not the healthy Torchies stuff. I'm talking about like, you know, the chicken, the one that's a chicken. I just went out of my head. The trailer park, trashy style. And then there's the off-menu stuff, like the Matador and other things that, like, if you're really, you know, kind of know what you're talking about, you can order those, and they're even bigger and better. All right, so that kind of food. I will binge watch television, usually the same shows that I've watched over and over again. I am now watching The Office for like the 15th time, but this is the super fan edition with all the extended cuts and all the other stuff, so it's amazing. Or I will go on social media to find people who are worse off than me and make myself feel better. Because I don't usually post about my calamities, but lots of other people do, which makes it really cool for me because I can go on and I can say, you're way better. You're way worse off than me. Then I will also text friends and tell them about all the hardships I'm going through, just to share the joy. And I will also sleep and have a snack. So what are your ways to sort of cope? You can do it online. You can shout them out. Like, let's just share our feelings with the group for a moment. Just anything that you do to cope.
Ditto.
What?
Doom scroll.
Doom scroll. I love that. Yes. I have done that as well. That's always great, just to go through like all the horrible things that are going on in the world, and makes you feel so much better. Kate. Yeah, heartwarming videos, where dogs are being reunited, somebody saving a puppy from a drain, that kind of stuff. It warms your heart. Anybody else? Reality TV? Stare at the wall. Okay. That also works. It's better than doom scrolling, I suppose. And some of you who are online, I'm sure you can share all that. I can't see it, so we'll assume that you were doing some of that as well. So yeah, we all have our coping mechanisms. But here's the thing. Despite all of the ways that we sort of cope with calamity, and we all have different ways of dealing with that, some of us, we just want to work harder, right? We're going to work harder. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. That's what I do. I will just keep working until I am absolutely just exhausted, trying to fix everything, trying to handle everything. It depends on how you approach it, right? Some of us, we get mad. Some of us, we withdraw into ourselves. Some of us, there's some of us that just are like, there's nothing to see here. I am done. Like, we're just gonna pretend that none of this happened, right? It's gonna be okay. It's fine, right? So all of us deal with these things in different ways, but underneath all of it, every single one of us, there's a universal thing that we're all longing for, and that's meaning. Meaning in the midst of it. We want it, even if it means we will strive for it, even if it means we will do whatever it takes to find that meaning, even if it means betraying our truest and best selves to get it, and even if it means putting our trust in things that aren't trustworthy. And I would say people and public figures and all the rest of it, right? So this is what happens to us when we are struggling to find meaning and we're trying to do it on our own. We will often betray ourselves, betray the things that we believe in. You wonder, like, how in the world, you say to yourself sometimes, how in the world could they believe that, right? When we should be having compassion, because that person that believes that thing that we think is so onerous and that you couldn't even possibly, like, how could a sane and sentient being believe that? They're doing the same thing that you're doing, which is trying to affix meaning to it, and they're struggling just as much as you are. We just are approaching it from different angles, but we're all wanting the same thing. We want meaning. We want this to mean something, right? That there's something that I'm going to get out of this. And you know what? John the Revelator, he knew this about his own audience. He knew that they were struggling to find meaning. And some of them were ignoring all the stuff that was going on around them. And some of them were withdrawing into themselves. Some of them were just saying, I'm going to cough it up. I'm going to assimilate to the Roman Empire. I've had enough, right? So he's writing to this group of people. And what John the Revelator is wanting them to know is that there's meaning in the midst of it. He shares a vision of word pictures, which is, what John does. John shares word pictures. We do the same thing. We're going to talk more extensively about word pictures in our own society and our own culture and how we're not all that different from the people who were reading Revelation, right? We're going to get to that. But these early Christians, he wanted to call them to faithfulness and trust that God was present with them And what he's doing is he's hoping that the people who've become complacent will lose their complacency. And the people who are suffering, they will find an incentive to persevere. Because they had a mission. They had a purpose. And John wanted them to connect with this great and glorious purpose that had been given to them through Jesus Christ, who said to his followers, you don't need to be afraid about me being gone because you all are going to accomplish even greater things than what you have seen. Now that is a tall promise, isn't it? I've often been troubled by that verse. Like, what? Are you serious? Look at all the things that Jesus did. And Jesus says to his followers, you will accomplish even greater things. There's greater purpose for you. You don't have to be afraid. Hang on. Persevere. This is what John is conveying. And so that's what we're going to dig into as we read through Revelation 6. And here's what I want us to hold on to. The one big idea that we want to hold on to today. Calamity often prepares ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. So let's jump into Revelation chapter 6, and I'm going to teach as I go. We're going to have some images. We're going to have some fun. Y'all with me? Yeah. All right. Yes, the applause sign came on. Some folks saw it. So let's do Revelation 6. It'll be on your screens. Thank you. There you go. Let's get nerdy together, shall we? All right. I watched, so this is John speaking. I watched as the Lamb, right? So remember last week, John hears the angel say, the Lion of Judah is coming. And then he's anticipating the Lion of Judah. And instead, there's a lamb that was slain. And so that was kind of a twist, a plot twist, right? And so now the Lamb opens the first of the 7 seals of a scroll that no one could open, right? No one could open this scroll to show like what was going to happen. And the Lamb opens the scroll, begins to break the seals. Right? And so if you can imagine a scroll in the ancient world with all of these wax seals that have been placed upon it with insignia, that's the image that John is wanting us to see. So then I heard one of the 4 living creatures that were in the throne room of God say in a voice like thunder, come! And I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider had a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. And so here's the image that John is talking about. So a rider on a white horse carrying a bow. You're like, well, that's interesting. So this is the rider of conquest, right? Well, John is drawing upon a cultural understanding that the people that were reading this would have gotten because he has this particular rider, the conquest rider, right, is carrying a bow, which is synonymous with a group of people that were part of the Parthian Empire. Now, where's the Parthian Empire? Well, it's in what is now modern-day Iran. And the Roman Empire had expanded as it moved northward, and they got to the Parthians, and the Parthians turned them back because of their unique fighting style. And so what John is doing here is he's saying there's a limit to empire. There's a limit to conquest. And even the deified emperor of Rome, who many of you, he's basically saying, are being compelled to worship, even the deified emperor of Rome has limits, right? So conquest, which is what Rome was all about, conquest, it has limits, but also there's going to come a day when even those who have been conquesting, right, who have gone out on conquest, that will turn back on them as well, right? So there's a two-edged sword when it comes to this. And so the image that he drew for them in their minds is of Parthians, right? And so that's what this is about, conquest. Then he goes on. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. Now, this is the image of the Red Rider. And so the interesting thing about the Red Rider is that, and scholars like Craig Kestra, who's done like amazing scholarly work on the book of Revelation, among others, have said that this Red Rider represents violence and war from within. So the conquest comes from without. That's the violence from without. The Red Rider is violence from within. There will be divisions. There will be civil war. There will be struggles with people that maybe even your own neighbor. And here's the other part of it, right? In order to keep peace, sometimes, in order to keep a semblance of peace, what looks like peace, people are often willing to overlook violence against their neighbors as long as it keeps the peace in their community. So in the ancient Roman world, the thing that everyone, lauded was the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Caesar Augustus brought peace to the world through superior firepower, right? And then was able to sort of maintain it through violence and the threat of violence and having troops all over the world, right? Including in Judea, which is where Pilate, the governor during Jesus' time, had enormous amounts of troops available to put down rebellions and to keep the olive oil and the fish from the Sea of Galilee flowing back to Rome. That was what he was charged with. And eventually, when he didn't live up to that, he was taken back to Rome and executed. So, but here's the thing for John and the Revelator is he's writing to people who understand that there are Christians that are being persecuted. There are people who are being martyred for their faith. And many of the churches that he's writing to, they had that experience. Others did not. And so he's basically saying, this is going to happen, right? There are people that will overlook violence against their own neighbors, people who are even like them, right, who have the same beliefs. They'll ignore it as long as the status quo and as long as they are not bothered. As long as it keeps the peace, we'll just let this rider ride. Then we have this. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Now here's an image of that rider with the scales, basically. So this is economic disaster and famine, where it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us when we see those numbers, but this was basically like you're living at a subsistence level, and it's so precarious that if you can't work, you will starve, right? And what John is essentially saying is that conquest and war and battle and struggle within, this semblance of peace, this idea that there's plenty, enough to go around as long as you trust the imperial Roman government who is making sure that they get theirs before anybody gets theirs. When there's rampant sort of individualism and materialism and consumerism that have been brought on by conquest and by war and all of the things that it takes in order to keep that going, then suddenly economic disaster is right around the corner. It's a precarious situation for everyone. But make sure that you don't touch, and this is a little political statement, don't touch the oil and the wine. Because who gets the oil and the wine? Rome. Right? They found in ancient Rome all kinds of barrels and so forth that came from Galilee. Now that's not connected to John at this point, but it was flowing from all over the world. That's what they were all about, right? They built roads, they did all the things just to make sure that they could move troops quickly and they could also keep the goods flowing. But it's tenuous. It's tenuous, right? And so John is saying this is what can happen. And then finally, when the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. And so here we have the Pale Rider, which, for those of you who are Clint Eastwood fans, that's why the movie was named The Pale Rider, right? Because of death, right? It brings death. And so these are things that are out of control, right? These are things that are out of your control, right? All of those things, right? So as you're sitting here and you're reading this and you're experiencing, you're going, yes, these are all things that happen. These are all things that are going on. They're out of our control. And death can touch on you in so many different ways, right? And so this was not put forward by John as an explanation of evil or an explanation of how the world works, or even as some might have interpreted as an explanation of how God works, because it's kind of nebulous in the way that this is done. Because a lot of people would assume then that God is at the source of, God is causing all things to happen, or at least allowing them. And John is not making any of those kinds of commentaries. In fact, John doesn't offer any of these explanations. It is unsettling in and of itself, and that is what John wants to do, is to unsettle the reader. Now, if you want to, I'm just going to go through these really quickly because we kind of need a little bit of a mental break from all of that negativity. So just as an image of seeing the four horsemen, sort of one of the most famous paintings of the four horsemen, you can kind of see them there a little more clearly. But I also found some other ones as well. This is the four horsemen of the pandemic. That one is holding toilet paper, in case you're not... Seriously? They say. And then this is the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, holding a cell phone. And the other ones say, and you are misinformation, the four horseman says, which is all too clear to many of us today. And then there's the four horsemen of the alpocalypse. Wait for it. It'll come, right? They're all riding alpacas. That's where that, anyway. All right, so let's continue. After that short mental break, let's continue. Oh, people are leaving. All right, so when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. I mean, that's great. But there's an interesting thing about this. This is an old painting, and you can see on the top, it's kind of hard to see for those of you who are in here, but for those of you at home, you can probably see it clearly. Underneath the altar there, where the winged beings are, there's people under the altar, and they're crying out. And so what John is doing here is he's demonstrating, like, these are people that have been killed for their faith. They have been persecuted. Most likely, many of them were persecuted under Nero, but eventually under subsequent emperors as well. And these were part of the people that basically it was good to sort of sacrifice this group in order to keep the peace, kind of thing, right? That these are the people who died for their faith and who are calling out for justice. And so John paints this word picture in such a way that you cannot be neutral when you see this, right? When you imagine this, these are people who died for their faith. They call out for justice. How can we not see them and to feel them and to be with them, right? And so it's a difficult word that John has for these people that are reading it, because he's basically saying that if you identify with these, your sisters and brothers, your siblings, then you may also experience the same thing. But there is an end, at least, to their suffering, right? There's something in mind. They are waiting, but that waiting is going to come. They are at rest with God in the moment, but even as they are at rest, they cry out for justice, because that justice will come. And then we begin to see with the next seal how that starts to play out, right? So here we go. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red. And the stars in the sky fell to the earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called out to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" So now even creation has turned on itself, right? This is an uplifting sermon, isn't it? Feeling good? All right. This is what Revelation does to you. Because even creation is turned on itself, the rich and the powerful and all the people that you would put your faith and trust in to make everything okay, suddenly they too are crying out, saying, "Who can withstand this? There is no answer to this." And then the answer comes. In chapter 7, because that's the end of chapter 6, and here's the beginning of chapter 7. I'm only going to touch on it because we're going to do chapter 7 next week. After this, so you would expect that everything falls apart, that it's the end of the world, that all of a sudden it's over, right? After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree. Now, all of these are images, word pictures. I mean, we get it. The stars falling from the sky. I mean, all of those kinds of things. John is speaking in word pictures, and here he suddenly paints a word picture. When you think that it's all going to blow up, all of a sudden it's like, nope, hold on. And this is what Revelation does. It's cyclical in nature. It brings you to the brink of the abyss, and suddenly there's God. And this is what John wanted his readers to know. He wanted them to understand that they could feel what they knew about the tenuous nature of existence. They could feel it, but they also shouldn't be cowed by it. Because there's more. And not only is there more after this, that this is part of a universal pattern of dying and rising, but there's more for us. There's more for you and me. That you and I are called when we see these things, when we experience these things. You and I are called to be witnesses to the love and grace and mercy of a God who may bring us to the edge sometimes, or we find ourselves at the edge, and God is there with us at the edge and will not let us fall. So, how do we do this? How do we figure this out? How do we become the people that discover our glorious purpose in the midst of calamity, attaching meaning to it and all the rest of it? Well, this is how I think that we can do this. And how we handle calamity and suffering is super important. And what we can learn from what John is teaching us today is simply this. First of all, receiving and feeling what we're experiencing when we experience calamity. So, allowing yourself, as Jess said when she was talking, I loved that. I was like, come on, that fed right into what I was going to be talking about. Because sometimes you have to let the suffering in order to let the power of it dissipate. Sometimes you have to let the feelings of fear in. Sometimes you have to let your own angst and all the things that you're feeling, you need to let that in, because when you let it in, you realize that it's a feeling. It takes the power away from it, as opposed to struggling against it, ignoring it, fighting against it, doing all the things that we usually do, trying to cope with it on our own. When we allow ourselves to feel it and then release it, it interrupts the cycle of pain and uncertainty. And we need to know this. You need to know this. First of all, these are feelings. Feelings. They are not identifiers. I get depressed. I do. I have days that I am just down. You know, my code words for my family is I just feel blue today. But it is depression. I feel depressed, but I am not depressed. Okay? Don't let that become the thing that identifies you if that's what you're struggling with. Or whatever it is, anxiety, all the rest of it. It is not who you are. It is what you are experiencing. It's how you feel. And you can get help for it. You can go to counseling. There's medication. There's all kinds of things. And there's no shame in any of that. But it is a feeling, right? It is a feeling that you feel. And sometimes you just feel it. It is not who you are. You are more. You are so much more than that. But that will take the power away from it and interrupt the cycle of pain and allow you then to do the next thing, which is to become curious. To become curious about what you are learning. Now, sometimes when you're in the midst of it, right, when you're in the middle of or the beginning of it or you're feeling it, you know, that's probably not the moment to start feeling curious. Because it's going to be distorted, you know, by all of the things that you're feeling. But becoming curious about it is so important, right? To be able to ask, what can I learn from this? What have I learned from this? I was in a car wreck years ago, and it was my fault. I pulled right out in front of somebody, and it was one of those moments where I pulled out and I looked over, and the car was like right there. And I thought to myself, I'm dead. I mean, it was a weird feeling. I just went, I'm dead. And it hit, and there were airbags and, you know, glass flying everywhere and all the rest of it. And then when everything stopped, I just had a moment where I started taking stock of myself. I am still here. I don't appear to be bleeding. I started taking stock of what was going on. And sometimes you need to stop and take stock of what's happening with you. But you can't stay in the car forever. You got to get out. And then when you get out, then you can start to wonder and ask questions about, like, well, what could I have done to prevent this? Probably shouldn't have pulled out in front of somebody, right? But I mean, the questions then can come once you've taken stock. And then as you begin to be curious, you can learn a little bit more about what you can learn. And once you do that, you can then move into being able to trust that there's more on the other side of it. To trust that there's more, to become open to the possibility that not only is there more on the other side of calamity, but there's more for you. That you have a purpose, a God-given purpose that is unique to you. That you are necessary to the world. That God has chosen you, as we talked about weeks ago, before the foundations of the world were laid. You have this purpose. This is the meaning that can come from calamity when we begin to realize that there's more. Imagine what it would look like for all of us if we were able to, in the midst of all the things that were going on around us, to be able to look at it through these lenses. It might change our outlook. It might change the way that we see it. But more importantly, it can change the way the world will be once we get it. Because when we get it, we then want to go out and change the world. Because you know what? Calamity is going to happen. Stuff is going to happen. John didn't deny that, but he did say that when you are in the midst of it, if you trust, if you hold on, then you will begin to understand what God has in store for you and for all of creation through you. And that's what you and I need to hold on to today, because calamity often prepares ordinary people like you and me for an extraordinary destiny. And that destiny is ahead of us, people. Church, hold on to it. We may be going through tough times, but there's more on the other side of it. For us as individuals, and for all of creation. Hallelujah. Amen. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, we are grateful for the opportunity to gather as a family of faith in all of the various ways that we gather. And we don't ignore the fact that we are going through tough times, but we also know that we can go through them with a sense of hope, that we can go through them with a sense of purpose, that we have much to learn about you and about who we are to you, and about our destiny and our glorious purpose. And God, I pray that you would instill with everyone that has been here today, that has listened to this, that God, you would give them that sense of purpose and hope, that they would see all of the visions that are part of Revelation as a way of giving hope and life and peace, that you would see them as symbols of a resurrection. God, we pray all of these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.